Salvete omnes. Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to talk about the work and thought of Thomas Hobbes, who lived from 1588 to 1679. He's most well known for his Leviathan, which we will discuss a lot, which was published in 1651, the end of the English Civil War. But he also published in a number of other fields. So what I'd like to do is just quickly kind of run through a little sketch of Hobbes's publications, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the background to those publications. We'll talk about his replies to Descartes' meditations, and then we'll move on to the Leviathan itself, discuss the main issues roughly in the order in which they appear in the text, and then finish with some of his thoughts about revealed religion. So first, let's just take a look at his publications. In 1629, he published a work that put him on the map, which was his translation of the ancient Greek historian Thucydides and Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. And Hobbes gained great fame and respect in the learned world for that translation, and it's still quite well regarded to this day. 10 years later, 1639, we have the Tractatus Opticus, a work on optics, which was a field that Descartes also published in and had great interest in. And of course, later on, Isaac Newton would publish a very famous work called The Optics. 1640, The Elements of Law. 1641, his objections to Descartes' meditations, which we'll take a look at as our first text from Hobbes to examine. 1642, De Cive, or On the Citizen. 1643, De Motu, or On Motion. 1651, Leviathan, for which he became maybe infamous to the point of sometimes being referred to as the Monster of Malmesbury. 1655, De Corpore, or On Body. 1658, De Homine, or On Humanity, or usually it's referred to as On Man. 1661, Dialogus Physicus sive de Natura Aeris, the dialogue on physics or on the nature of air. 1666, De Principiis et Ratiocinatione Geometrarum. So as we can see, Hobbes published in the fields of mathematics, physics, physiology, and of course political philosophy. And I'm going to try to argue that his treatment of these subjects is united. I'm not the first one to suggest this by any means, but I think we can find a kind of unity in a lot of his discussions on this field by reading them in the context of his materialism. And his materialism is roughly the view that everything can be explained in terms of matter and motion. Matter in motion. And certainly we'll look in a moment. He claims something like this already in his replies to Descartes' meditations. And although perhaps it's a little bit not obvious, there's another claim closely related to this one that it looks like maybe he also believes, namely that only matter and motion exists. And this would mean not only is it an explanatory thesis about how things can be explained, but also an ontological thesis about what there is. There just is only matter and motion. So for example, disembodied spirits that don't take up space do not exist, or something like that. If we consider a being like God to not be to be immaterial or not to be material, then that sort of being would not exist either. It seems like he's forced later on in his life to start thinking that maybe God actually has or is a body. So this is kind of a unifying theme that points us to the background of this scientific revolution. Which was going on in the background to Hobbes's life. And I want to say a few things about how this relates to Hobbes's work in general and specifically in Leviathan. So let me just start by saying that one of the revolutionary transitions that occurred during the scientific revolution, which began roughly with the work of Copernicus in the early 1500s and concludes with the work of Newton in the late 1600s, was a revolution in conceptions of natural states. That is, natural states with respect to motion and rest. And Hobbes accepts a certain kind of principle that wouldn't have been widely accepted in most of the scientific circles of Western Europe prior to the scientific revolution. Not all, but certainly the more dominant view was inherited from Aristotle, which was basically that there were these elements, these sublunary elements, where sublunary just means below the sphere of the moon or below the moon. Sublunary elements of earth, water, air, and fire, which had their natural place, with earth at the center, water at the next level of natural place, then air, then fire, going in concentric circles outward. And then after that, the superlunary element of ether. So the thought is that each of the four elements have this natural place and a natural state when they're in that place, which is rest. This had already been challenged by Descartes. In Descartes' physics, he articulates this radical principle of inertial motion in a straight line. Galileo had accepted some sort of inertial motion, but it seemed like really he was thinking of it in terms of inertial circular motion, which on a local level would look like a straight line. But on a global level, if we step back and look at the Earth as a whole, then it's circular motion, so to speak, around the surface of the Earth. So what's important is this concept of inertia, as it's often called, or basically what we're going to mean when we refer to this concept of inertia is that rest is not the only natural state of matter. That is to say, motion is also a natural state of matter. And we'll look at Hobbes's statement clearly of that principle in Leviathan. So now we're going to say rest is not the only natural state of matter, motion is the other natural state. And we'll see in a moment how that idea of inertia figures into his political philosophy. With regard to religion, we can see the date there. That date, 1651, was the end of the English Civil War. Where there were something like certainly more than 200,000 deaths, fatalities, and probably even more than 800,000 deaths or fatalities, so starting to approach the level of the million mark for fatalities. at least according to some estimates. Getting concrete numbers on those figures is very, very difficult and maybe even impossible. But nevertheless, the low estimates are still hundreds of thousands of deaths, so massive fatalities due to this English Civil War, which in significant measure was the result of religious disagreement. The details of the story are quite complicated and have to do with the origin of the Church of England when it broke away from mainstream Roman Catholicism under the reign of Henry VIII with his Act of Supremacy, by which he became head of the Church of England. And then over the course of the next 100+ years, there was sort of a kind of a swinging back and forth between Protestant and Catholic rulers in England, and this made the state of civil life full of potential conflict, grounded in some sense on these religious disagreements, initially between Catholics and Protestants, but later on between different kinds of Protestants, even more radical and less radical Protestants. So that became another grounds of disagreement leading to the Civil War. So it was this context in terms of civil life that Hobbes's Leviathan was basically written and then ultimately released. The government was still fairly unsettled even after the end of the war, so that's one reason in some sense he got lucky and didn't really suffer too much direct persecution during his lifetime, although he was threatened quite a lot, and the publication of this work in England was ultimately banned. So I guess you could say that is a form of persecution that he was subject to. So what we're going to do now is start with a look at Hobbes's response to Descartes' meditations. And what we'll see is Hobbes trying to explain mentality or our mental lives without appeal to something like a spiritual substance, by trying to, in some sense, ground mental activity and our mental lives in matter in motion. And I'll just mention briefly, although he doesn't spend a lot of time in the Leviathan directly talking about mathematics, it is kind of important in terms of presenting a kind of model for rationality. So when Hobbes starts to discuss what it is to reason, as we'll see in a moment in his reply to Descartes, he takes mathematics as a model of that. Of course, he rejected many of the Cartesian innovations in mathematics itself because he believed first and foremost that geometry should be the fundamental science and the fundamental mathematical science, and so looked with suspicious eyes at the way in which Descartes began to shift the solution to geometric problems into a more algebraic formulation. So Hobbes was very distrustful of Descartes' movements in that shift from looking at geometry as foundational to looking at perhaps algebra or algebraic solutions to geometric problems. And one example of this is that Hobbes sometimes talks about the fact that square values are of a different kind than linear values, right? Because square values are referring to geometrical areas, whereas linear values are referring to geometrical lines, and we can't directly even compare the size of a line to the size of a square because we're talking about two different kinds of quantity. So it was for reasons like those that Hobbes rejected most of Descartes' kind of innovative work synthesizing geometry and algebra. So for example, in his Lessons of the Principles of Geometry, Hobbes writes, "Homogeneous quantities are those which may be compared by epharmosis, application of their measures to one another, so that solids and superficies are heterogeneous quantities because there is no coincidence or application of those two dimensions. No more is there of line and superficies, nor of line and solid, which are therefore heterogeneous. But lines and lines, superficies and superficies, solids and solids are homogeneous." If you remember, one of the arguments that Descartes presents in his meditations is this notion that I exist is true whenever I think it. And one of the things he derives, Descartes, from this statement, or the truth of the statement, I exist is true whenever I think it, is the notion that I am a thinking thing. A res cogitans, or I am a thinking substance. Where a thinking substance is radically different from and distinct from a whole different kind of being, a whole different mode of being, a different way of being, a kind of existence from extended substance or body. So this claim about I exist is true whenever I think it, and although he doesn't use the phrase in the Meditations, he's become famous for it, even though it comes from another book. Je pense donc je suis, I think therefore I am, or cogito ergo sum. The notion is that from this claim, I exist is true whenever I think it, we can derive the claim that I'm a thinking thing or a thinking substance, which is a different kind of thing or a different kind of substance than extended substance or body, or what we might also call matter. Being a thinking substance is also to be a soul or a spirit. And from this, it looks like maybe you can derive some other things like the immortality of the soul. If it turns out, for example, that the soul or the spirit is indestructible because it can't be broken into different pieces like extended substance or matter can, then you might conclude that the soul is immortal. Hobbes goes against that radically, as we'll see in Leviathan. So let's take a quick look at Hobbes's reply to this kind of chain of reasoning. And this was published, by the way, with the original Meditations. It does not seem a valid argument to say, I am thinking, therefore I am a thought, or I am understanding, therefore I am an understanding. For in the same way, I could just as well say, I am walking, therefore I am an act of walking. Non enim videtur recta argumentatio dicere ego sum cogitans ergo sum cogitatio, neque ego sum intelligens ergo sum intellectus. Nam eodem modo possem dicere sum ambulans ergo sum ambulatio. So Hobbes wants to break down the connection between this notion that I think, or I am capable of thinking, therefore I am a thinking thing. So he wants to break down that inference. What he's going to try to do is say that essentially matter can think. Just as, for example, matter can walk, or matter can move. And ultimately, he wants to argue essentially that thinking does not require the existence of a soul or a spirit. We can understand what it is to think in all different sorts of ways, in all different possible ways in which human beings actually think, without appeal to the existence of something like a soul. So let's take a look at that next movement. It is possible for a thing that thinks to be the subject in which the mind, reason, or understanding inhere, and therefore this subject may be something corporeal. A thing that thinks is something corporeal, for the subjects of all acts seem to be understood only in terms of matter or of body. We cannot separate thought from the matter that thinks. It seems we should infer that a thing that thinks is material rather than immaterial. Potest ergo esse ut res cogitans sit subjectum mentis, rationis, vel intellectus, ideoque corporeum aliquid, rem cogitantem esse corporeum quid, subjecta enim omnium actuum videntur intelligi solo modo sub ratione corporea, sive sub ratione materiae. Non possumus separare cogitationem a materia cogitante, videtur inferendum potius rem cogitantem esse materialem quam immaterialem. So here we have this kind of materialistic viewpoint that ultimately everything is going to be explicable in terms of matter and motion, including human thought. So we're going to have the claim something like human thought can be understood in terms of mere matter in motion. What about rationality, you might ask? What about the notion that we're capable of making deductive inferences that are somehow different from imagination? So part of the debate between Descartes and Hobbes revolves around the powers of the imagination and what they're capable of. And if it turns out that imagination is dependent on sense and sense is dependent on sensory organs, then maybe it might help to shift the debate to rationality not concerned with imaginative powers, but rather purely conceptual powers. So something maybe like pure mathematics or something like that. So the thought is maybe we can escape Hobbes' conclusion that human thought can be understood in terms of mere matter and motion by sort of transferring our interest from human thought that depends on the senses and therefore on sensory organs to human thought that does not depend on the senses. So he has an explanation for how we're capable of deductive reasoning that doesn't rely on the existence of something like human thought that's independent of material bodies moving. And we'll take a look at that now. It remains then for me to concede that I do not grasp what this piece of wax is through the imagination. Rather, I conceive it through the mind alone. And what we have there is a quotation that Hobbes is making from Descartes. So Descartes is saying, I conceive this piece of wax through the mind alone, not with the imagination, and therefore mental activity, at least some mental activity, does not depend on the senses. And here's Hobbes' rejoinder. But what if we are to say now, we're reasoning perhaps merely the joining together and linking of names or designations by means of the word is? It would follow from this that we draw no conclusions whatever by way of argument about the nature of things. Rather, it is about the designations of things that we draw any conclusions. That is, whether or not we in fact join the names of things in accordance with some convention that we have arbitrarily established regarding the meanings of these terms. If this is the case, as it may well be, then reasoning will depend on names upon imagination, and imagination, perhaps as I see it, upon the motions of the corporeal organs. And thus, the mind will be nothing but movements in certain parts of an organic body. Super est igitur ut concedam mene imaginari quidem quid sit haecera, sed solamente concipere. Quid iam dicimus, si forte ratio cenatio nihil aliud sit, quam copulatio et concatenatio, nominum sive appellationum per verbum hoc est. Unde colligimus ratione nihil omnino de natura rerum, sed de earum appellationibus nimirum utrum copulemus rerum nomina secundum pacta, quae arbitrio nostro fecimus circa ipsarum significationes, vel non. Si hoc sit, sicut esse potest ratio cenatio dependebit a nominibus, nomina ab imaginatione, et imaginatio forte sicut sentio ab organorum corporeorum motu, et sic mens nihil aliud erit praeter quam motus in partibus quibus tam corporis organici. So here we have Hobbes trying to reject the Cartesian attempt to separate mind from matter, in effect, or separate spirituality or the spirit, the existence and functions of the spirit or soul from the existence and functions of the extended organic body. The next step in trying to see where this materialism is going to go is to look at the way that Hobbes employs this notion in politics. And the way it goes is going to be like this, that all of human life in general, that is, all human life and action, can be understood in terms of matter and motion, and more particularly, matter in motion according to the principle of inertia. So let me first kind of sketch how it's going to work in Leviathan, and then we'll just sort of read through with that overarching interpretive framework in mind. Basically, what he's going to do is say that there's a particular kind of motion that we call life. And life is going to be the sort of thing that's just like other kinds of motion. So it's still subject to inertia. And what this really ultimately is going to mean is that living things strive to continue to live. That is to say, living things strive to continue their particular kind of motion that we call life, or the motion of a living body. So living things, just by the fact that they're matter in motion, they must obey this kind of principle of inertia, which is that they're going to, as it were, on their own, always strive to continue their motion, that is, to continue to live. And it's going to turn out that empirically in the world around us, there's certain things that living things are going to need to do in order to continue to live, that is, continue to move in this particular way. For example, eating food or something like that. And we'll come back to this in just a moment, but let's take a look at the part in Leviathan where Hobbes makes this move from the universal principle of inertia, where everything tries to, as it were, continue to move or continue to stay at rest, depending on what state it happens to be in, and the notion that living things have a proper kind of motion. That when a thing lies still, unless somewhat else stir it, it will lie still forever, is a truth that no man doubts of. But that when a thing is in motion, it will eternally be in motion, unless somewhat else stay it, though the reason be the same, namely that nothing can change itself, is not so easily assented to. When a body is once in motion, it moveth, unless something else hinder it eternally. Life is but a motion of limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part within. What is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body? So there we have, I've sort of assembled a number of passages together that illustrate this general principle of inertia that governs all matter in motion, and the way that's applied to the particular case of life and the particular case of human life. And in more, I think, modern parlance, perhaps, we would say that something like this: all people are driven by a kind of impulse to survive. And that's going to turn out to be the foundation for all of the good things and a lot of the bad things that we find in the world around us. So we're going to turn to Hobbes' very famous state of nature in just one second, where that state of nature is going to derive from this claim that all people are kind of driven by this impulse to survive. But first I want to take a quick look at his treatment of the origin of religion, which has to do with our attempts to understand primarily the bad things that happen to us, although presumably also we're trying to understand the good things that happen to us as well. And so let's look at a quick passage where he talks about the origin of religion in the state of nature, and then we'll move on to the state of nature itself. This perpetual fear, always accompanying mankind in the ignorance of causes, as it were in the dark, must needs have for an object something. And therefore, when there is nothing to be seen, there is nothing to accuse, either of their good or evil fortune, but some power or agent invisible. In which sense perhaps it was that some of the old poets said that the gods were at first created by human fear, and for the matter or substance of the invisible agents, so fancied, they could not by natural cogitation fall upon any other concept but that it was the same with that of the soul of man, and that the soul of man was of the same substance with that which appeareth in a dream to one that sleepeth. So he claims that essentially religion is derived from the fear of not knowing where the bad things that happen to us come from, and that comes from an ignorance of cause and effect. And so what we're going to see is ultimately religion in the state of nature seems to be a very limited thing because of the fact that we don't have much information around us that we can infer about any kind of God. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Going back to this notion that all people are driven by an impulse to survive, Hobbes also adds on to this the notion that there is often scarcity in the state of nature. And what we mean by saying that there is scarcity in the state of nature is that there are going to be occasions where two people might need the same thing to survive and they both can't have it. There's not enough available for both of them to survive. And so there being scarcity in nature combined with the drive of all people to survive and therefore to get what they need to survive, like, for example, food, is going to lead to a situation of intense competition. For scarce resources. And that competition will become a form of conflict. Why will it become a form of conflict almost inevitably? Well, Hobbes says that we're naturally equal. So some of the transition between the fact of there being scarcity in nature, there being competition for these scarce resources like food, will lead to conflict because he says that human beings are naturally equal. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he's not going to say that we're all the same. It's not that we're all the same, but rather in cases where one person, let's say, is physically stronger than another, they still might be capable of, for example, getting a few friends together with them and physically overwhelming somebody who is in competition with that person and their friends or maybe their family. So the thought is that we're equal enough. We're equal enough so that in the cases where we're not literally, let's say, of the same physical strength, that difference is not relevant for understanding our responses to the condition of scarcity. Another difference might be in intelligence, but again, those differences in intelligence are not going to be enough such that a group of people or an individual over a long period of time can't make up for the difference. So that's the principle of natural equality in the state of nature for Hobbes is not the claim that we're all literally equal, but rather that we're close enough so that the differences in intelligence and the differences in physical strength are not large enough to make it so that an individual can't be overwhelmed by others. And what that means is that I can always have hope of acquiring that scarce resource in competition with another. So therefore, it's worth it to, as it were, risk an actual conflict with the person who I'm in competition with whom I'm in competition, because of the fact that I might win. I always have a chance to win. Why do I always have a chance to win? Because of natural equality. Because I'm equal enough to my opponent that in an actual conflict, there's always the chance that I might win. So because of this, he says the result is a war of all against all. Sometimes I want to use his spelling, so the result is a war of all against all. And there are a couple other reasons that he cites for this war besides conflict. I'll just briefly mention them. Another is security. So he says that even if I'm successful in defeating my initial opponent, let's say in a simple model where it's me and another person fighting for a piece of fruit that's going to allow the person who gets it to survive, in a kind of simple model of that sort, once I get that, let's say I win and I get that piece of food, well, I'm going to start worrying about, well, someone might take it from me now, right? While I'm not paying attention or something like that. So even if I, as it were, win on the competitive side for scarce resources, I'm still going to maintain this antagonistic attitude towards everyone else because I'm going to be afraid for the security of what I've acquired. Beyond competition and security, or the word he uses is diffidence. Beyond competition and diffidence, he also uses this idea of glory, which is that something like human beings seem to have a natural want to be praised or to be spoken well of and not to be spoken badly of. And so this is another thing that's going to cause conflict, even if I've won the competition and also have secured a lot of protection for what I've acquired through competition. Nevertheless, I also want to be spoken well of, and I also don't want to be spoken bad of, and that will cause me to react in some cases violently to other people if they speak poorly of me or don't speak well enough of me. So because of all of that, the result is the state of nature is a state of war. And it's a radical state of the war of all against all. And that's terrible, right? And in Hobbes' very famous, memorable phrase, the state of nature is one that is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So it's really bad. Now, there might be a silver lining maybe down the road, and I'll mention what that might be later on. But essentially, the state of nature, as he puts it and lays it out in the initial part of Leviathan, is really terrible. Okay? So that means that the rational person, what they're going to want to do is they're going to want to escape from the state of nature. So once he's established through this principle of inertia, natural equality, and scarcity, and built upon that scaffolding this picture of the state of nature as a war of all against all, then he's going to say that any reasonable person is going to want to escape from that. And that's going to lead him to formulate these laws of nature to govern political life. And here we're thinking of laws of nature not in terms of physics, but in terms of politics. And the first one, as we'll take a look at in just a moment, is going to be to seek peace. So any rational person, according to the story that Hobbes is telling us, is going to want to seek peace because they're going to recognize how horrible and terrible the state of nature is. And in fact, it's kind of interesting because he also claims that the state of nature can be found amongst the Americans. And that's a tradition that we'll see come up again when we look at Locke. So we've seen that Hobbes claims that there's this state of nature where it's a war of all against all that's due to competition, diffidence, or security and glory. And I want to briefly read to you that passage about the Americans because it's a theme that we'll find ourselves returning to in the future. It may peradventure be thought there was never such a time nor condition of war as this, and I believe it was never generally so over all the world, but there are many places where they live so now. For the savage people in many places of America, except the government of small families, the concord whereof dependeth on natural lust, have no government at all, and live at this day in that brutish manner, as I said before. Now, obviously, there are lots of problems with that passage, and I'm not reading it to suggest that Hobbes is somehow accurately reporting or depicting life in America during 1651. By no means. And in fact, he had good evidence had he sought it out to the contrary. So one might read a passage like this as especially problematic because of the fact that there was good evidence that went against these claims. But I just wanted to point it out because the use of the Americans during this period, I think, reflects on the world historical condition of the time, which is this, or has been described by some historians as this Columbian exchange, or this new radical increase of interaction between the old world of Afro-Eurasia and the new world of the Americas. And so we see this new world of the Americas affecting the thought of almost all of the early modern philosophers. Going back to this issue of the state of nature leading to these laws of nature, and these laws of nature are arrived at by the rational person who, of course, wants to leave the state of nature. Because the state of nature is so terrible, and also because the state of nature is one in which one's motion, as it were, one's life is constantly threatened. And that's not good in an absolute sense, but good vis-a-vis this kind of proper motion of the living organism. So the rational individual wants to leave the state of nature, and so they arrive at the conclusion that in order to do that, they need to seek peace. This is the first law of nature. Now, there is a slight caveat to the first law of nature, which is something like this. If you find yourself in a situation where someone is behaving irrationally towards you, that is attacking you, then you always reserve the right to defend yourself. So we can imagine a situation where we're living in civil society, in an organized commonwealth that has laws, but one individual chooses at some point to break those laws and then try to assault me or rob me in my home or something like that. And so Hobbes needs to be able to say that in those circumstances, you are rightfully able and justifiably able to defend yourself. So that's the first law of nature. And then there's a series of 18 others. Okay, so there are 19 total laws of nature. We're not going to go through all of them, but I just want to give you a sampling of some of that list of 19 of the laws of nature that Hobbes derives from the desire of the rational individual to escape from this horrible state of nature, which is the state of war. Every man ought to endeavor peace, as far as he has hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. Seek peace and follow it, and by all means we can, to defend ourselves. So there you've got the first law of nature. And let's move on to the second. That a man be willing, when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself he shall think it necessary, to lay down this right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. And here are a couple others. That men perform their covenants made, without which covenants are in vain, and but empty words, and the right of all men to all things remaining, we are still in the condition of war. If a man be trusted to judge between man and man, that he deal equally between them. For without that, the controversies of men cannot be determined but by war. So the notion is the general principle of escaping from the state of nature is going to lead us to a number of other laws of nature. So the second one, as we saw, was to give up those rights that others will give up in order to secure peace. So in the state of nature, everyone has a right to anything they can possibly get. That's a natural right, as Hobbes conceives of it. So in the state of nature, you have a right, a natural right, to steal things from other people, okay? And the thought is that the rational person confronted with the horrors, like the English Civil War, of this kind of state of war of all against all, will realize that it's a good idea if they give up the right to steal from others, as long as others give up that right to steal from them, because both of us will then be better off in that situation. And the rest of the laws similarly derive from this concept of trying to escape from the state of war. So a judge must deal equally. We must perform our covenants, because the thought is that if we don't, then we've dissolved and devolved into the state of war. Okay, so there's a couple other things I want to briefly mention, and then we'll conclude with some of his thoughts on revealed religion, and in particularly Christianity. The thing I want to mention before moving on to revealed religion is Hobbes' interesting treatment of morality. And according to Hobbes, morality, as we normally conceive of it, I think we being the average person living in the United States, in Michigan in 2019, that oftentimes the person in the street, as it were, thinks of morality as existing before civil society. So that is to say, we don't need to be in a political body such as the United States to still have a morality or something like that. And Hobbes thinks that that's wrong, that outside of organized political life, there are no laws. And something can only be immoral or bad or a sin even if it's a transgression of a law. So sinning or doing wrong in the traditional sense, he reconceives of as violations of the law. And since prior to the existence of civil society, there is no law, that means there can also be no sin. And so I think that has some interesting implications that I want to sort of just suggest that it's worth thinking about, because it seems as if, although the state of nature is horrible in one obvious sense, maybe it's not so horrible viewed from the perspective of salvation or from the perspective of sin. Because the state of nature is also a state without laws, which means it's a state without sin. So I just want to take a brief look at Hobbes' claim that morality or good and evil don't exist in the way that most people conceive of them outside of an established commonwealth. The science of the laws of nature is the true and only moral philosophy. For moral philosophy is nothing but the science of what is good and evil in the conversation and society of mankind. Good and evil are names that signify our appetites and aversions, which in different tempers, customs, and doctrines of men are different. And therefore, so long a man is in the condition of mere nature, which is a condition of war, as private appetite is the measure of good and evil, and consequently all men agree on this, that peace is good, and also the way or means of peace, which are justice, gratitude, modesty, equity, mercy, and the rest of the laws of nature are good, that is to say, moral virtues, and their contrary vices, evil. So what he's saying there is that prior to the established commonwealth, or in the state of nature, is just appetite. Appetite and aversion. So whatever I want is good. Whatever I don't want is bad in the state of nature. And of course, he observes that different individuals typically want very different things. And so there is no common or objective morality if that objective morality presupposes that different people will agree on what they like and dislike, which they obviously don't. Now I want to move on to the subject of revealed religion, where revealed religion is, for Hobbes, primarily his discussion revolves around Christianity. And it's very long, and it's very involved, and it's very complicated. He uses a lot of scriptural passages and discussions to justify his position. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to look at 3 different topics in this very long and extended discussion he has about Christianity. And these are miracles, the afterlife, and salvation. I've already said a little bit about salvation, but I'm going to say just a little bit more. So miracles, he says, are the combination of 2 features. And so it's very interesting what those features are. They are, a miracle is something that is rare and inexplicable. And it has to have both of these features. He gives some arguments about this. He says, well, you know, we never see a cow talking, so that would be kind of miraculous because it's both unusual in that we don't really see it happen, but also we couldn't explain how it's possible. There are things where we might not be able to explain it, and one example he uses is, how is it that one living being produces another? This seems inexplicable, but nevertheless it's common. And because living beings producing another living being of its own kind through, say, childbirth, even if it can't be explained or can't be understood, it's common, and so therefore it's not treated like a miracle. He says the first rainbow was a miracle because it was the first. But then every rainbow after that was no longer a miracle. So this is kind of interesting, an interesting conception of what a miracle is. And one, I think, interesting corollary that seems to emerge from this is that it's going to turn out, he believes, that the dawn of modern science means that we're going to be able to explain everything in terms of, yep, you guessed it, matter in motion. And if that's the case, then it seems like starting, so to speak, in Hobbes' own day, in the 1600s, that there would be no more miracles, because nothing would be inexplicable anymore. And he actually says miracles have ceased. Now, there were prior theologians, Protestant theologians, who had argued that the days of miracles were over. So it's not that Hobbes is alone in thinking that miracles are no longer occur, but I think his explanation in terms of the explicability of natural phenomena is a bit different than the traditional theological explanations, which had to do with claims, for example, that all that's really needed for salvation is the gospel, that we don't need miracles anymore, or something like that. Let's take a brief look at the afterlife. So Hobbes does not believe in eternal damnation. I think this is one of the most striking and important features of his thought. Again, he's not alone here, but his reasons, I think, are quite interesting to note. There are a few different reasons. One is simply biblical and conceptual, based on claims in the Bible. So if Jesus is giving us eternal life, then it doesn't make sense for the damned to continue to have life in being eternally damned. So if the saved get eternal life, then the damned must not get eternal life, which means that they just cease to exist. They are annihilated. They cease to exist. Now, he has a political corollary to this position of eternal damnation, which is something like this. Well, one of the things that can undermine the existence of an organized commonwealth is if someone thinks that the punishment in the afterlife is going to be worse than the punishment in this life for transgressing the laws of the civil society or the commonwealth. And so the notion of eternal damnation in Hobbes's mind is the kind of thing that will come in and undermine the stability of the state and maybe return us to that horrible state of nature. So therefore, belief in eternal damnation is something that we want to do our best to avoid, and we can avoid this by closely looking at the Bible. Last but not least, he says, salvation, even in Christianity, the state of nature already, he seems to suggest this, but he wants to repeat it, in effect, in the Christian state, is a matter of obedience to laws, which is a direct carryover of his claims about what it is to be godly, as it were, in the non-Christian commonwealth, and faith in Christ. I don't want to dwell too much on exactly what this means, faith in Christ, although I think it's a reasonable question to ask, and I think the way Hobbes tries to answer it is itself also quite interesting. I just want to note that this is a lot less than traditional Christianities of his day. So for example, there's nothing in here about the Trinity. Of course, he has a whole different treatment of the Trinity, which is very questionable or very odd, but at the very least, it's not part of his formulation of salvation. And belief in the Trinity would have been accepted by all of mainstream Protestants and all of mainstream Catholics. So what we can conclude, I think, from all of this is that Hobbes puts together many of the different transformations that were occurring in his day in a very unique and interesting synthesis.